If you've ever stood up for someone who couldn't speak for themselves, or wished you had, then this story is for you. Hit that like button if you believe doing the right thing is never the wrong choice. Subscribe for more powerful true-to-life stories that shine a light on quiet heroes. And stay with us till the end, because today, a waitress loses her job for defending a child. But what she gains may be more than she ever dared to hope for. The late afternoon sun bathed Jacksonville in a soft golden hue as Douglas Harlan stepped out of his black town car and held the door open for his young grandson. The doorman at St. George Bistro, a high-end white tablecloth restaurant tucked along the St. Johns River, nodded respectfully. Everyone in town knew who Douglas was. At 62, he was the founder and CEO of Harlan Global Shipping, one of the country's largest maritime logistics companies. But today, he wasn't the billionaire tycoon. He was simply a grandfather taking his grandson out to lunch. Benjamin, just 7 years old, walked with hesitant steps beside him, one hand gripping a little folder of sheet music from his piano lesson. He wore a pale blue button-up shirt tucked carefully into khakis, his light brown hair combed neatly to the side. If you looked closely, you'd see a slight delay in his movements, a half-second beat behind the rhythm of the world. He repeated certain words twice when he spoke, and sometimes didn't speak at all. The doctors called it a speech and language processing disorder. But to Douglas, Benjamin was simply Benjamin. His only grandson, the son of his late daughter, and the brightest part of his life. The maitre d' greeted them with the usual formality and led them to a quiet corner table near the windows. The restaurant hummed with soft piano music, and polished silverware clinked gently against plates. Benjamin settled into his chair carefully, glancing around as if trying to decode every face, every sound. Douglas offered him a reassuring smile and slid a small toy dinosaur across the table, one of the little rituals they had developed. Their server, a young woman named Clara, greeted them warmly and took their order with practiced grace. She didn't rush Benjamin when he repeated his drink choice twice. She didn't flinch when he looked down instead of meeting her eyes. She simply waited, calm, patient. Douglas noticed that. As they waited for their meal, Benjamin reached for his water glass with both hands. His grip was careful, but not quite steady enough. The glass wobbled slightly, and in an instant, his elbow bumped it. The cup tilted and spilled its contents across the table, sending a small wave of ice water over the edge and onto the pants leg of the man seated at the next table. There was a brief silence. And then the man, middle-aged, dressed in a tailored navy suit, with an air of self-importance, jerked back his chair and stood up abruptly. "You've got to be kidding me," he barked, glaring at Benjamin. "Watch where you're going, kid." Benjamin froze. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His small hands clutched the edge of the table. His eyes were wide and frightened, paralyzed by the sudden aggression. Douglas instinctively leaned forward, about to say something, but before he could, someone else stepped in. Before the man could raise his voice again, a presence inserted itself between him and the frightened child. "Sir, this is a child," came a firm, steady voice. "If you need to yell at someone, yell at me." The words didn't come from Douglas, but from Clara Jennings, the waitress who had taken their order just minutes earlier. She stood protectively in front of Benjamin, her posture calm but unwavering. Her hands were at her sides, but her eyes were locked onto the man's with a quiet defiance that instantly shifted the room's energy. Clara was 32, had worked in restaurants since she was 19, and had long given up on the idea of finding a different path. She didn't have a college degree, and no one had ever really expected her to. Most of her life had been about surviving one shift at a time. But beneath the crisp uniform and practiced smile was a woman who knew what it felt like to be scared, to be shouted at for things she couldn't control. As a little girl, Clara had struggled with a stutter. Words often got stuck in her throat, especially when adults raised their voices. She remembered the heat in her cheeks, the shame of not being able to say "I'm sorry" fast enough to avoid the next insult. The faces had changed over the years, but the feeling hadn't. And now she was watching that same fear, the same paralysis, on the face of a boy who had done nothing wrong. I said, the man began again, but Clara didn't let him finish. He spilled a glass of water, she said quietly, but there was steel behind her voice. Not a drink on your head. Not a lawsuit. Just a cup of water. He's 7. The man opened his mouth as if to argue, but several nearby diners had started watching. A woman 2 tables over shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Someone else murmured, "Geez, it's just a kid." Clara turned slightly, placing herself sideways so she could still shield Benjamin but also speak softly to him. "Hey, sweetheart," she said, crouching a little so they were eye level. "You're not in trouble. You're just a kid learning, that's all." Benjamin blinked, then gave a faint nod. His lips trembled as though trying to form words, but he didn't need to. Clara's tone did all the speaking for him. Douglas, watching from his seat, hadn't moved. But his eyes were fixed on Clara now, not with the detached curiosity of a restaurant guest, but with focused, searching attention. He had seen his fair share of performances in boardrooms and public forums, had watched people fake empathy for gain. This wasn't that. Clara didn't even know who he was. This wasn't about image. It was instinct. The man in the suit scoffed, brushing at his pant leg as if the minor spill were something truly egregious. "Whatever," he muttered, sitting back down with exaggerated annoyance. "Maybe don't let special needs kids into restaurants they can't handle." Clara didn't flinch, but something sharp flickered in her eyes. She stood upright again and turned back toward Benjamin, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Come on, hon," she said. "Let's get you back to your seat. I'll bring you a fresh glass." As she guided him carefully back to the table, Benjamin's small hand reached for hers. Without a word, he clutched her fingers tightly, his way of saying thank you. Clara looked down briefly, and her expression softened. There was no pity in her eyes, only kindness. She helped him into his chair and knelt beside him for just a moment longer. "You did nothing wrong," she said. "Promise me you'll remember that." Douglas leaned forward, studying the exchange. Benjamin, usually withdrawn in public spaces, now sat a little straighter. His breathing had slowed. He didn't look afraid anymore. And the waitress, this woman whose name he hadn't even caught, had made that happen in less than 2 minutes. Clara stood again, brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and turned toward the kitchen. For a fleeting moment, her calm cracked, and her eyes flicked toward the manager's station. She knew what might come next. Confrontations with customers, even for good reason, weren't tolerated in places like this. But she didn't regret it. Not for a second. Douglas Harlan remained seated, his hands folded lightly on the table, watching everything unfold with quiet precision. He had not said a word, not when the water spilled, not when the man exploded, and not when the waitress stepped in. He was a man used to observing, not reacting. In business, patience was often more valuable than power. And in that moment, patience served him well. But inside, something was shifting. He couldn't take his eyes off the waitress, Clara. He hadn't caught her name yet, but her face was now etched into his memory. She hadn't hesitated, hadn't weighed consequences or waited for approval. She had simply done the right thing. And she had done it with a grace and quiet strength that spoke louder than any corporate slogan or mission statement he'd ever approved. Benjamin sat back at the table now, his small hand still firmly clutching Clara's fingers. Douglas noticed it immediately, and the meaning of it wasn't lost on him. His grandson didn't touch people. Not easily, and certainly not strangers. In public settings, Benjamin usually kept to himself, retreating into a private world of routine and careful silences. Even with therapists and teachers, it had taken months before he'd accept a handshake or eye contact. And yet here he was, holding tightly to this woman's hand as if it were the only safe place in the room. Douglas leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing just a touch, not in judgment, but in thought. "Who is she?" Clara gave Benjamin a quick reassuring smile, then gently released his hand and turned toward the kitchen. But she didn't make it far. Just a few steps in, the restaurant's manager, a sharp-jawed man in his 40s with a too-polished look of someone trying too hard to climb corporate ladders, stepped into her path. They spoke in hushed tones near the service station, but Douglas could read body language as fluently as any ledger. The manager's arms were crossed, his posture stiff, condescending. Clara stood straight, but there was a tension in her shoulders now. She wasn't arguing, but she wasn't backing down either. Her lips moved slowly, measured, careful, as if she knew this wasn't the time to stumble over her words. Douglas caught the slight tightening of her jaw, the flash of something, humiliation? Frustration? That passed through her expression before she quickly composed herself. He saw the manager glance toward the customer who had complained, the man now sipping his drink again with exaggerated normalcy, as if nothing had happened. Douglas remained silent. He could have stood up then. He could have walked over, introduced himself, flashed his last name like a badge of influence, and shut the whole thing down with a few well-placed words. But he didn't. Not yet. There was something about this moment, something raw, unfiltered, that he needed to see play out. People's true character wasn't revealed when they were praised. It was revealed when they were under pressure, unprotected, and unsure of the consequences. Clara didn't know she was being watched by someone with the power to change her life. And that made what she'd done real. Benjamin looked up at his grandfather, a small crease between his brows, confusion lingering in his expression. Douglas leaned in slightly and placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "She's okay," he murmured, almost to himself. The hum of the restaurant continued around them. Plates clinked, glasses clattered, waitstaff bustled in and out of the kitchen. But at their table, time felt suspended. Douglas watched as Clara took a slow breath, nodded once to the manager, and turned away, her steps a little heavier now, but her head still high. He didn't know yet what the manager had said, but he could guess. Douglas's gaze followed her across the dining room. He was no stranger to power, but there was a kind of authority in what Clara had done that money couldn't buy. And still, he said nothing. Not yet. Clara could feel the shift in the air before the words were even spoken. It was the kind of change you learn to sense after years working in places like this, subtle but heavy. A silence too intentional. A sideways glance from a fellow server. A manager walking just a little too quickly toward you. She knew. She had always known that sticking her neck out came with a price. But somehow, it still hurt when the bill finally came due. "Clara," the manager said, his voice flat and clipped, "can I see you in the back? Now." He didn't wait for an answer. Just turned and walked toward the hallway that led past the kitchen, expecting her to follow. She did, because she had dignity, even when dignity was all she had left. The hallway was cold, a sharp contrast to the warm light of the dining room. It smelled faintly of lemons and steel polish. Clara stood just inside the narrow corridor, arms at her sides, eyes steady. She didn't slouch. She didn't fidget. She stood like someone who was ready. The manager closed the door halfway, but not fully. It wasn't privacy he wanted, just enough space to say what he needed to say without being overheard by the guests. Staff didn't need to hear it. They'd figure it out soon enough. "I'll keep this brief," he began, crossing his arms with mechanical precision. "What you did out there may have come from a good place, but it was inappropriate. Highly unprofessional." Clara tilted her head slightly but didn't speak. He continued. "Intervening in a guest dispute like that, especially raising your voice, was not your place. You caused a scene." Her voice, when she finally used it, was calm and even. A child was being yelled at by a grown man. He was frightened. "And you made it worse," the manager snapped. "Our job is to diffuse, not escalate. You embarrassed a guest in front of half the restaurant." Clara took a breath. He humiliated a little boy who has special needs. "This isn't a daycare," the manager said coldly. "It's a fine dining establishment. Our clientele expects a certain level of decorum." You acted on emotion. That's not acceptable. Clara nodded slowly. It was the same logic she'd heard all her life. Don't cause trouble. Don't speak up. Don't make things worse. Even when someone else is in the wrong, keep your head down and let it pass. I'm sorry if it made the restaurant look bad, she said, her voice soft but unwavering. But I'm not sorry for what I did. The manager exhaled through his nose. Well, unfortunately, that doesn't change anything. There was a brief pause. We're going to have to let you go. Effective immediately. There it was. Clara felt her stomach sink, but she didn't flinch. Not even a blink. Her fingers, pressed together in front of her, stayed steady. She'd learned to take bad news with quiet, with grace. You don't cry in front of people who want you to break. You carry it out the door with you, and you deal with it on your own time. All right, she said simply. The manager looked almost surprised at how little resistance he got. I'll have your final paycheck processed by next week, he added, as if trying to sound generous. You can leave now. Clara turned without a word and walked back down the hallway toward the kitchen. The noise returned in a rush, pans clanging, orders shouted, the clatter of plates. It was the same sound she'd lived in for over a decade, and it suddenly felt foreign. Like a language she no longer spoke. She paused at her locker just long enough to untie her apron, fold it in thirds, and set it down gently on the shelf. Then she walked through the kitchen doors and into the dining room one last time. She wasn't expecting anyone to notice. And for the most part, they didn't. The hostess was busy at the front. Two servers chatted quietly as they polished silverware. No one looked her way. Except one person. Benjamin. He sat at the table, his little shoulders stiff, his back unnaturally straight. He was trying hard to behave, trying not to cause any more trouble. But when he saw Clara walking past, something in his face shifted. His eyes, wide and searching, locked onto hers with an urgency she recognized too well. She stopped. Without a second thought, Clara turned and walked over to him. She crouched beside the table, careful not to interrupt the meal, careful not to embarrass him, but entirely present. "Hey there," she said softly. Benjamin didn't say anything. He didn't have to. She reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind his ear. "You did nothing wrong, sweet boy." His lower lip trembled. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Then, as if on instinct, he reached for her hand. Clara squeezed it once, just enough. She looked up at the man across the table. Douglas Harlan. His face gave nothing away, but his eyes were not the same ones that had walked in with Benjamin that afternoon. He didn't nod. He didn't speak. But he saw her. Not as a server. Not as a woman being fired. But as someone who had stood between harm and a child. That was enough for Clara. She stood, gave Benjamin one more soft smile, then turned toward the door. She didn't rush. She didn't slump. She didn't look back. Outside, the Florida sun hit her skin like a spotlight. She blinked once, adjusted her purse strap, and exhaled slowly. Another job gone. Another line on the resume she didn't have. But somehow, this time, it didn't feel like the end. It felt like the start of something else. She just didn't know what it was yet. Douglas Harlan had been silent long enough. He watched Clara walk toward the exit, the restaurant door slowly swinging shut behind her. The quiet dignity with which she carried herself, even as she was being dismissed, struck him deeper than he expected. There was no scene, no outburst, only principle. Only heart. He rose from his seat with a purposeful calm that carried the full weight of his name. Benjamin turned to follow him with his eyes but stayed in his chair, sensing something in his grandfather's posture that said, "This part isn't about me." Douglas stepped away from the table and made his way toward the front of the restaurant, his polished leather shoes silent on the hardwood floor. Conversations around him dimmed slightly. People noticed him. His presence was the kind that disrupted without trying to. Not flashy. Just undeniable. He didn't stop at the hostess stand. Instead, he turned toward the bar, where the manager was scribbling something onto a clipboard, still visibly tense from the encounter moments before. Douglas walked straight behind the bar, not hesitating, not asking permission, and calmly placed a card on the polished counter between them. The manager looked up, startled. His eyes scanned the name on the business card, and his posture shifted instantly. Douglas Harlan, the older man said evenly. Harlan Global Shipping. Recognition flickered across the manager's face like a flicked switch. He straightened immediately. Sir, Mr. Harlan, I wasn't aware that you were. Douglas didn't wait for the apology to finish. She didn't fail your restaurant, he said, his voice low but sharp, like a piano string pulled too tight. Your restaurant failed her. The words hit like a stone tossed into still water, quiet but deep. The manager swallowed, speechless. He opened his mouth again but said nothing. Douglas turned away, not waiting for a reply, not expecting one. Some truths didn't need debate. He moved through the front of the restaurant with quiet urgency, catching a glimpse of Clara just as she reached the sidewalk. The sun had dipped slightly lower, casting long amber shadows across the pavement. She was walking slowly, but steadily, head held high, her purse strap slipping down her shoulder. Ms. Jennings, he called out. She turned at the sound of her name, surprised, guarded. Her eyes flicked over him, uncertain. Douglas slowed his pace as he reached her, stopping a respectful distance away. He held nothing but calm in his expression. I'm sorry to chase you down like this, he said. But I didn't want to leave things the way they were. Clara blinked, clearly unsure what to expect. I'm not here because I feel sorry for you, Douglas added. I'm here because what you did in there was extraordinary. And not many people would have done it. She exhaled quietly, her eyes still hesitant. I lost my job for it. I know, he said, and gently extended his hand, not for a shake, but holding a small card between his fingers. Clara looked at it. The name, Douglas Harlan, was printed in clean serif font above a bold blue logo, Harlan Global Shipping. Her brows lifted slightly. You're that Harlan? I am, he said. But today, I'm just Benjamin's grandfather. There was a pause, soft and mutual. The tension between them dissolved, replaced with something simpler. Human. I watched everything, he said. And I want you to know, you didn't go unnoticed. Clara looked down at the card again, then back at the man in front of her. I don't know what to say, she admitted. Douglas gave a small smile. How about starting with a cup of coffee? He gestured gently toward the corner cafe just across the street. My treat. No strings. Just conversation. Clara hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Okay, she said. I could use a moment to sit. As they crossed the street together, side by side, she asked softly, Why me? Douglas replied without missing a beat. Because in a room full of people who looked away, you were the only one who didn't. The cafe was small and quiet, tucked into the corner of the block like a secret waiting to be discovered. Inside, the walls were painted a warm cream, with faded photographs of sailboats and bridges along the river. The air smelled of cinnamon and espresso, and the hum of the espresso machine provided a soft backdrop to the low conversation at nearby tables. Clara sat across from Douglas at a window seat, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she hadn't quite started drinking yet. She was still trying to make sense of the last hour. The shock of losing her job hadn't fully worn off, but neither had the strange, unexpected calm that had followed. Across from her, Douglas stirred a packet of sugar into his drink, his movements measured and precise. He wasn't in a hurry, but there was purpose in the way he carried himself, even in casual conversation. You know, he said finally, looking out the window for a moment before turning back to her, Benjamin doesn't usually reach for people. He has boundaries. His world is quiet, careful, structured. Clara nodded slowly. I noticed. He's gentle. Douglas smiled faintly. He is. But he's also guarded. It takes him a long time to let someone in. His teachers have been working with him for years, and even now, he struggles to connect. But today, he held your hand. Clara looked down at the mug in front of her. I didn't even think about it. It just felt like he needed someone. That's exactly it, Douglas said. You didn't think. You acted, from instinct. From kindness. She looked back at him then, brow furrowed. Why are you telling me this? He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folder, placing it gently on the table between them. It was sleek navy blue, with a silver logo embossed on the cover, Safe Plates Initiative. Clara stared at it, puzzled. I'm starting something new, Douglas said. Something different from everything I've built before. A restaurant concept that does more than serve food. A space that serves families, especially ones like mine. Places where kids like Benjamin aren't just tolerated, but welcomed. Where parents don't have to apologize. Where staff are trained not just in etiquette, but in empathy. She opened the folder slowly. Inside were sketches of a dining space, wide aisles, noise-reducing materials, sensory-friendly menus, family tables. There were notes about hiring practices, community events, even partnerships with local therapists. I want every single employee who walks into these restaurants to understand not just how to serve, Douglas said, but why they're serving. What it means to be the safe person in the room. Clara looked up at him, still unsure where this was going. And that's why I'm asking you, he continued, to lead the training program. You'd help design the curriculum, coach new staff, teach them what it means to really see people, especially the little ones who can't always say what they need. Her eyes widened, and she immediately shook her head. Mr. Harlan, I'm a waitress. I've never led anything in my life. I didn't even finish community college. I can't run a program. Douglas didn't flinch. He didn't look surprised. You're not here because of your resume, he said simply. You're here because of what I saw today. You didn't need a title to lead back there. You just led, with heart. And that's the only kind of leadership I care about right now. Clara blinked, then let out a short breath. You really think I could do this? I do, Douglas said. But it doesn't matter what I think. It matters what you believe. She didn't answer right away. She looked back down at the folder, then out the window, watching a group of school kids pass by with backpacks too big for their shoulders. I've spent so much of my life being told to stay in my place, she said softly, that I wasn't built for more. Douglas leaned forward. Then maybe it's time someone showed you where your place really is. She smiled faintly, not ready to believe it yet, but willing maybe to try. 1 month later, the conference room inside the first Safe Plates training facility buzzed with quiet energy. The long windows let in the morning light, casting soft beams across the hardwood floors and minimalist decor. It didn't look like a restaurant classroom. It felt more like a space where something personal could happen, a place where new beginnings could take root. Clara stood at the front of the room, her hands loosely clasped, a dry erase marker tucked into her fingers. She had never stood in front of a group like this before, not as a speaker, not as a leader. The only trainings she'd ever attended were mandatory sessions about upselling wine or carrying 3 plates without dropping them. But today was different. Before her sat 15 young people, new hires for the pilot location of Safe Plates. Most of them were barely out of high school, some had never worked in a restaurant before. A few looked nervous. A few were yawning, trying not to show it. But they were all listening. Because Clara wasn't talking about technique. She was talking about presence. About noticing the quiet child in the corner. About pausing instead of pushing. About kindness not as a bonus, but as policy. She told them stories, not from manuals, but from experience. About the boy who flinched when a plate was dropped, and the mother who apologized for the 100th time. About the teenage dishwasher who never spoke but lit up when someone remembered his name. About how sometimes, the smallest thing you do stays with someone forever, and you may never know it. And the whole time she spoke, she felt something unfamiliar humming inside her: confidence. Not the loud kind. The earned kind. The kind that grows when you finally step into the space meant for you, even if it took longer than you expected. She was just wrapping up a section about sensory sensitivity when the door in the back of the room opened with a quiet click. She turned toward the sound instinctively, mid-sentence. And there he was. Benjamin. He stepped into the room, his small hand gripping the fingers of his grandfather. Douglas gave Clara a nod, then released the boy's hand. Benjamin walked forward slowly, carefully, then faster, the moment he saw her face. The trainees watched with curiosity as the little boy made his way to the front of the room, clutching something red in both hands. An apple. Clara's breath caught in her chest. He was smiling, really smiling, and in a single motion, he offered her the apple and wrapped his arms around her waist in a tight, silent hug. She didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, she let out a laugh, light, surprised, a little shaky. She knelt down, set the apple on the floor beside her, and whispered just loud enough for him, and maybe Douglas, to hear. "Looks like we're both not in trouble anymore." Benjamin pulled back and nodded solemnly, as if confirming a secret between them. Clara stood up and turned back to the class, her cheeks flushed with warmth. She picked up the marker again, heart steady, voice clear. "All right," she said. "Where were we?" In the back of the room, Douglas slipped out quietly, unnoticed by most. But not by Clara. She caught the door closing out of the corner of her eye. She didn't need to say thank you. Not yet. There would be time for that. For now there was work to do, and she finally knew it was hers to lead. Standing up for children is never the wrong thing to do. It may not always be easy. It may not always be safe. It may cost you comfort, reputation, or even your job. But if you're lucky, it might give you back something far greater: the certainty that you didn't stay silent when it mattered most. Clara Jennings didn't know that her decision to step between a frightened boy and an angry man would cost her the only job she had. She didn't know who was watching, or that the moment would lead her to an entirely different life. She only knew what it felt like to be small, afraid, and without someone to stand beside her. And in that moment, she chose to be the person she once needed. Too often, we expect children, especially those with special needs, to behave with more composure and patience than the adults around them. We expect them to adapt to a world not built for them, to navigate public spaces that overwhelm their senses, to smile through confusion, and remain calm when they are misunderstood. And when they can't, we punish them, not always with words, but with glances, with impatience, with subtle exclusions that tell them they don't belong. But the truth is, some children do not have the words to explain what they need. Some do not have the voice to say, "Please don't yell," or "That scares me," or "I'm trying my best." And so they rely on the rest of us, their parents, their teachers, their communities, to speak up when they cannot. To notice. To intervene. To protect. When Clara knelt beside Benjamin and whispered that he was not in trouble, she didn't just calm a child. She reminded everyone watching that humanity still matters in the everyday. That there is strength in gentleness. That you don't need a title to do something important. She didn't rescue him. She simply stood between harm and helplessness. And isn't that what courage often looks like? Not grand gestures or sweeping speeches, but a quiet voice saying, "This is not okay," even when it comes at a cost. In a society that rewards silence and punishes disruption, especially in the name of professionalism, it's easy to believe that walking away is safer than getting involved. But safety doesn't always equal integrity. Sometimes the most dangerous thing we can do is remain silent when someone needs us to speak. Clara lost her job because she prioritized kindness over protocol. And yet, in losing what she thought was everything, she discovered something that had been missing all along: purpose. The lesson isn't just about Clara. Or Benjamin. It's about what kind of people we choose to be when no one is watching, when there's no applause waiting at the end of our action. Do we side with convenience, or do we choose compassion? Do we uphold the rules, or the people those rules should be serving? We teach children not to bully, not to yell, not to hurt others. But who teaches adults how to be gentle? Who reminds us that emotional intelligence matters just as much as efficiency? That kindness isn't weakness, it's the purest form of strength? Maybe it starts with small moments. A hand held across a table. A soft voice in a loud world. A person willing to take the fall for doing the right thing. Maybe it starts with someone like Clara. And maybe, if we're lucky, it ends with more places like safe plates, places where inclusion isn't a policy, but a practice. Where people are hired not just for their resumes, but for their ability to see others. Where children can be themselves, and where adults are reminded that their most important job is not to serve the meal, but to serve with heart. Because at the end of the day, the measure of a society isn't in how it treats its strongest, but in how it protects those with the quietest voices. In a world that often measures success by salaries and titles, Clara's story reminds us that sometimes, losing something isn't the end, it's the beginning. She walked out of that restaurant thinking she had failed. That she had crossed a line that cost her everything. But what she didn't know then was that line wasn't the end of the road, it was a doorway. She didn't lose her job because she made a mistake. She lost it because she refused to look away. Because she chose a child's dignity over corporate decorum. Because she stood for something no uniform could define. And in doing so, she stepped into something far greater. Because the truth is, she didn't lose her job. She found the work she was meant to do. If you've ever been punished for doing the right thing, remember this: losing a job is never as frightening as staying silent in the face of what's wrong. Like and subscribe for more stories that honor quiet courage. And tell us in the comments. Have you ever seen someone get punished just for standing up for what's right?